we've reached the point where we're going to go up in scale now. This is the part of the semester where I'm going to start to wrap things up. We've only got a little bit more than a week. I will give you a final assignment shortly. But we're going to start with planet scale modeling with Beyond the Limits. It's a bit dated by now. Hopefully, you've looked at least chapter 4, and you can see that we've come a long way since this was written in the well, it was published in '92, so it's 30 years old. But it is important, and that's why we're looking at it here. It's important because it gained a widespread popularity. It continues to be read. I mean, we're reading it. And it has its roots in the 70s, and it's important because it comes out of some of the earliest, what I would call environmental movements. It comes out of the 70s, hard on the heels of Silent Spring, and work done by a guy called George Woodwell at... he might have been at Stony Brook. Anyway, it doesn't matter. George Woodwell, Silent Spring, what's Leopold's book? Sand County Almanac, Ehrlich's Population Bomb. It's all part of that. But these folks carried on, and they built one of the first simple computer models of how Earth works. So I said it's relatively simple. And it was accessible. The model was accessible to more than just people who had hardcore computing infrastructure. This is long before the earliest versions of this are long before there were desktop computers. World3 actually was available to run on desktop computers, and hence its simplicity. They did not have. There were less computing power in desktop computers than is in our way less than is currently in our phones. It's rooted in a manufacturing economy. If you look back and see what was going on in the 70s and 80s, we were still rooted in consumer goods. We were still rooted in making things, and the kind of economy we have now, rooted in computers and services and distributed systems, was actually not even imagined at that time. So this didn't foresee the development of a service economy, an information-based economy, and it was still sort of rooted in making things and using them and throwing them away. So that said, let's look at World3 at its highest level. At the highest level, World3 has 5 modules. And this is a diagram that obviously I've drawn. And it shows World3, and then at the first level of hierarchy, it shows the 5, what are we going to call these? Sub models that make up World3. So there's one that focuses on population, and population has an age structure. That's really the dominant thing. And we're going to go through these one at a time because I'm going to walk through the appendix. It has an agricultural sector. It has an economy. The agricultural note, the ag is different than economy, but you can see economy is focused on industrial and services output and a job market. And then there are these 2 other modules, non-renewable resources. This is where things come from. We've talked about that a little bit so far. And then persistent pollution, which is where things go to. And they were really worried about the accumulation of nastiness in the environment. So that's the overall structure of World3. It has the highest level, which is the model itself, 5 first order submodels, and then a couple of those submodels have second order models in them. So let's walk through. I think I can close this anyway. I can open it again later if we need it. So let's actually start with the appendix and look at how it's look at the detail of how each of these models work. So in the appendix, we find that that there are each of these submodels is represented, and they start with the two that don't have any lower level hierarchy. And I want to call your attention in these to a number, to several things. And the first is that in persistent pollution, there are three stocks. There's a stock of arable land, there's a stock of the pollution itself, and there's a stock of technology that is related to the production or alleviation of pollution. Those three stocks are connected by, in the context of this model, about an average sort of complexity of variables that influence each other. So you'll see in World 3 that much of the structure is related to the interconnection of stocks rather than to the stocks themselves. This is sort of in contrast to how we've been thinking. But these will be causal relationships. I haven't tried to break out the causal loop structure because they don't always loop. And as you will see when we come back to chapter 4, some of the connections are complicated. But anyway, you can see that the arable land turns up a lot, it turns out. All right, so that's persistent pollution. It has arable land, it has agricultural pollution, it has persistent pollution by industry, and then it has some scaling stuff that has to do with technology. And it has a little bit of decay. Non-renewable resources is much simpler. Here the stocks are the resources themselves, and technology related to conserving or not conserving these resources. I'm pretty sure it's in chapter 4. They talk a lot about how, as we talked about with when we were talking about, I don't know, we talked about supply and demand, but anyway, as resources become more limited, their price goes up. The amount of energy going into getting them out of the ground goes up. I think there's a plot somewhere. Anyway, the expense of getting them out goes up. They talk about, in one of the things they talk about in chapter 4 is that as the economy develops, one of the signs that we're all going to die is that we devote more and more energy to getting resources. So those are the two relatively straightforward ones from their 5. Then population sector doesn't actually have submodels, but it's quite a complicated model in and of itself. And here is where the age structure comes in. So let's look at this age structure. First thing I want to note is that there is not a feedback like we've been doing with bunnies and that sort of thing. The number of births is a decision. It's a very complicated set of decision making, but it doesn't have to do with the total population. So eventually we get to a variable called total fertility, and as we back out, we go back up the sort of decision, the causal chain. You get to things like family income expectation, income. There's a lifetime perception. There's consumption. All these things then go into birth. And I guess well, this is interesting. There's some reproductive lifetime in here. Once people are born, then we get into this life expectancy feeding into this as people get older. So the population sector in World 3 is quite different than how we've thought about it, because it does have this age structure um, that that is important in how much people consume. World 3 is really has a sort of worldview that humans consume, and that drives a lot of things. Um, all right, so that's the population model, and I have not looked at this in detail, but partly what I want you to see is the level of the detail. Then we get into so now we've moved on into the agricultural submodel, and this is a submodel of the submodel. Um, and there's a lot more stocks here in the food. So this is the food production part. This is where we're growing food to to keep our people alive. Again, arable land, not surprising. Arable land comes into this model in at least two places. I don't think I've missed anywhere. And then there's a couple of other stocks. Perceived food ratio. I think that's a sense of shortage or abundance. Land fertility as a stock coming into land yield. And then that land yield technology. So again, there's technology in the food production model, and these are the things that control yield, the efficiency. And then the dotted lines across the thing, and here's an agricultural inputs. This will turn up. Well, I think it turns up. It turns up at least indirectly in other places. But this is things like fertilizer and that's that sort of thing. So this is their model for food production. All right, then moving along, land fertility is probably the simplest one. The you can make land better, like my brother-in-law has CSA up near Plymouth. He's been farming up there for 20 years, and oh gosh, longer than that. Anyway, a long time. And when he, it was all rocks and sand when he got there, and now it's producing more tomatoes than you know what to do with. And then here, this is like not taking care of the land as well. And my colleague Pete Nowak worked on this kind of thing. So anyway, you can see that one's fairly simple. A5, A6. So then here's arable land. Here's the core of the arable land part. They they're really focused on so arable land is here. Two things can happen to arable land. It can erode, either by degradation or by actually washing. And this is the part that Pete worked on, actually washing into the streams and lakes and clogging up the waterways and all that sort of thing, taking nutrients with it. There's potentially arid land, which can be developed a lot like what Peter Seeley did up there north, a little bit, just composting like crazy. And then there's, or you can take so here you're making arable land, here you're losing arable land, and here you're losing arable land, and you're turning it into urban and industrial land. Like there's a horrible development going on just across from Nelson State Park. Well, not just across, but just down the road from Nelson State Park. It makes me very sad. But some of this is inevitable, and some of it is good because it creates jobs and that sort of thing. But anyway, so land. This is sort of I think of this as land use and land cover change. So that's the agricultural model, and then we move into the economy, and in the economy, basically there's one stock, and let's see what it's centered around capital, industrial capital. Here's efficiency. Here's well, here all of this is kind of efficiency um, coming into capital investment. Um, Here's depreciation over here, and somewhere in here is population. Anyway, this is essentially some measure of demand, and basically it's saying that in the economy as imagined in the late 80s, there will be capital, and it will be driven by um, uh, consumption and what people want. Now, I kind of said there wasn't a service, that there wasn't such an emphasis on a service sector at that time. There is a service sector, and it too consumes capital. It has outputs. Um, and again, I haven't studied this one. Here's where population comes in here. There's got to be population coming. Oh, there it is. Population coming in here. So these things at some level are driven by how many people there are and what the details of how old they are whatever. All right, and then finally there's a labor market. I don't really understand this one. Here's the industrial capital. Here's services capital. Um, I think this is essentially delayed labor utilization fraction. It's a stock. I assume it has to do with available labor. Arable land comes in here. So we've got the service sector, the industrial sector, the service sector, ag sector, and then I think this is labor. This is labor market. So that's the quick run through at the lowest levels of the model. And of course, now I do want my picture back. World3. So I haven't drawn any interconnections here because they're complicated. I started to try to do some symbolic circles and arrows and paragraphs on the back. But I stopped because I don't know how to do them. But they are kind of hinted at here in chapter 4. Let's go back to beginning of chapter 4. This is talking about whether we live or die. And now we start to get, so in 4.3, you start to see they're pretty sloppy. They would not get full points if these were causal loop diagrams in our class, but they would get some credit because the basic idea is here. Population goes up, population goes down. Industrial capital goes up, industrial capital goes down. So this is a new investment, output, new investment, output, depreciation, etc. So that's kind of roughly the loops we saw. Here's cultivated land. So now we're starting to connect things together, and you can start to see that. Let's see, have we got all of the sectors here? Not well. There's food, but you can start to see that conceptually they have linked their submodels together in causal loop form. And here is another sub unit of how these all are connected. We're not, it would be we could do a whole class on World3, and I actually thought about that a while ago. Oh, here's the one I was looking for the other day, just a minute ago. But it doesn't. It's just what? It's not quite worth it at this stage. You should think about how things have changed since Chapter 4 was written. Again, not an assignment, but something to think about. The world is different, and having rereading this as I was getting ready to assign it, it struck me how different the world is and how different the worldview is. It's important to remember that these folks come out of the doom and gloom era. We still have a bit of that about, but I think we've moved more into a let's fix this thing. Here's the this is kind of at the core of their um, uh, argument. This is the plot that says, you know, as we put more and more energy into pulling out raw materials, we get into trouble. And then these are their various graphs. So that is a quick run through of World 3. I'm going to show you in another video, I'm going to show you a completely different way of thinking about the Earth system that was at the core of our design in the Earth Institute. And then I'll do a couple of videos about sort of things like paradigm changes from the Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. And then we will be done, more or less. All right. Don't hesitate to ask questions. I can be available on Blackboard BBC Ultra, whatever that thing is called. A couple of people stopped by this morning, and I'll try to have more availability that way. All right. Have a good afternoon.